Welcome to the University of Life at uoflife.com. I'm Sean Roundy, and this is a presentation on ways of knowing and the intuitive connection. Now, the intuitive connection is the main point I really want to get to. That's extremely useful, valuable, etc. But before I drill into the details, I like to give an overview, the big picture of where this information fits in. So let's first take a look at what is knowing in the first place. Now, what knowing really comes down to, it's simple. It's simply neurons in your brain making new connections. The technical term for this is branching, and it's represented by this image on page 1, all the dots connected by the little lines. That's how your brain knows things. A new idea comes in and makes a new connection. I've seen actual video of this, of the neurons doing this, kind of shaking around a little bit and moving together and making new connections. It's really cool. And if you continue to use that new thought, then it strengthens and becomes more permanent. So that's what knowing is in our conscious experience of life. And so when a new idea comes into your head, you choose to believe it. Now you can say you know it, but this has nothing to do with whether or not this new idea is true or not. It's just there's a thought, you believe it or you don't, and that's what we call knowing. And so a lot of people say common sense is, it's something is obvious. This is an obvious fact. Everyone agrees. And a lot of times what common sense really is confirmation bias. And if you're not familiar with that, boy, there's a useful term for regulating your beliefs a little bit. It simply means that if you have a belief in your brain, then your brain tends to look for things that confirm that that is the truth. So you'll pay attention to people who agree with you and sometimes dismiss people who don't. So being aware of that can help you watch out for it and be a little more open-minded to new ideas and different ideas that can enhance your sense of knowing, of truth, of putting all the pieces together. And in the end, life is 100% subjective. We used to have this idea that objectivity, if we could just measure things and prove them, then we'd remove the self, the subject, the subjective nature of knowledge. And we know now that while there are things that we can stack up a lot of evidence for and we all kind of agree on, and so we call them facts, still your experience of knowing that is subjective. I'm going to introduce you to a couple, I guess, pioneers who made some valuable contributions, some great useful insights, William G. Perry and Mary Belenky. And then we'll talk about, and they mentioned a few ways of knowing from their studies, and then we'll talk about other ways of knowing sensation and intuition. So let's dive in here. Perry was an educational psychologist, and he ran some studies back in the 50s and 60s on Harvard students who, as they entered college, he kind of observed how they processed information, processed their world. And then Belenky came along with her associates, and they said, let's not just study Harvard men, let's study women everywhere. And so they came up with a somewhat parallel list of things. So let's go through those quickly. The first one that Perry mentions is dualism. And dualism is simplified down. It just means that you look at the world in kind of black and white. Things are true or false, right or wrong, good or bad. There are authorities who know the answers. It's a solid, kind of safe way to see the world. And this is really important for children when they're just young to feel like there are answers and the world's not too confusing and overwhelming. So that's fine as a stage of development. Now, Belenky, as she did her studies, they looked more at, it's been a while since I read the book, but I have the impression they looked more at women who were not just children anymore and still had this kind of dualistic viewpoint, and she called it received knowing. In other words, you receive knowledge from other people. People tell you what the truth is. And women who were stuck in this mindset, who had not progressed to more complex ways of thinking and processing information, it was sometimes or often because they were in maybe authoritarian kind of situations where people were bossing them around and they really hadn't nurtured their own power of processing information and being their own authorities. We'll get to that more in a minute. The second stage, multiplism by Perry, this is where students sometimes would realize, wait a minute, there's not always one correct answer. The world is not that simple. Sometimes there are different and contradicting facts and I believe them both, or one maybe is equally valid as the other one. And so they're getting into more complexity, as you can tell. And sometimes the downside of this is they throw the baby out with the bathwater and they say, well, if dualism wasn't absolutely true all the time, then it was worth nothing. And they may have a distrust of authorities or even a distrust of processes and evidence. And that's what actually Belenky came up with, what she noticed, that subjective knowers who went to the deep end of having their own voice and their own opinion, sometimes they distrusted even reasoning and logic. They felt like, I should say, that these were maybe manipulative tools, and they felt more comfortable expressing their own, having their own opinions just because they felt like it. And so emotional thinking can fall into this group and such. And again, women who got kind of trapped in that situation, sometimes it was because they were in abusive situations and maybe they were reacting against that. Perry's third area is called relativism. And relativism is even a little bit more complex than that, where it says, yes, sometimes answers are relative. Should you wear a coat when you go outside? Well, it depends, doesn't it? Is it snowing or is it blazing hot summer? So it depends on the situation. And Belenky's parallel to this is called constructed knowing, where you take information, your own thinking, your own experience. Other circles may call this procedural knowing, and you figure things out and you're open to new information, and you take some information from authorities, but you make up your own mind and feel comfortable with your own opinion as well. So that's a pretty good stage to be in. And by the way, each of Perry's 3 stages here, in the first place, it's not like you go from one to the other to the third. You may have aspects of this going on all the time, because there are some things you probably still feel or think dualistically about, like this is true, this is good, that's bad, mass murder bad, right? We're going to agree on that. And maybe multiplism, sometimes I like French vanilla ice cream, you like Rocky Road or burnt almond fudge. That's fine. It's a purely subjective decision and so forth. But I want to point out one of the distinctions within relativism they came up with that I really like. It's really useful. It's called commitment. Now, if you're in relativism, imagine that you're always weighing the options. Well, what's best for this situation? What does this person need? Well, it might be different than what I would do. That can be exhausting. And so eventually you can come to certain points where you say, this is my opinion. I'm comfortable with it. I'm not closed to new information if you want to bring me something new, but I don't have to keep making up my mind, keep deciding all the time what my opinion is here. And so that's commitment, and that's useful. And then on the other end of the scale, Belenky's group came up with something that's horrifying. I think it's tragic. And she called it silence. And this is women who had grown up under extreme abuse, where they thought of language as just another tool to control people, and they did not even have an inner dialogue going on inside their brain. They didn't even have that inner voice. That sounds like really tragic to me, but a good thing to be aware of. So is that all? Are those all the ways of knowing? No, absolutely not. Let's take a look at a few more. Knowing, again, is just a way of how do we receive and process information. So another way of knowing is sensation. And this means gathering data from the 5 senses. So your touch, smell, hearing, and a lot of people trust this kind of sensory information because they experienced it firsthand. So that's why we say seeing is believing. Once you see it, you're like, well, now I know it's true. I didn't have to have someone else tell me. I saw it for myself. It's obvious, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not exactly the way it works, because really, remember that confirmation bias I mentioned before? The fact is, believing is seeing, because the way your brain works, let's say it sees this beautiful Colorado road with the autumn leaves and the snow-capped mountains, and it's gorgeous, right? But what your brain does is whatever it has inside there already, it scans the world for patterns that match it. It's like that matching game with kids where you're turning cards over and trying to find 2 airplanes or 2 doctors or 2 cups or whatever the deal is. So if you are looking at this picture of this beautiful forest, but inside your head you have some fear, some anxiety, some unresolved trauma, then your brain is scanning, looking for traumatic things to match. And so rather than saying, let's go hike through that beautiful nature, that will be so great, it might see a bear behind every tree. And even though you're imagining it, you're looking for it. And so when you see something move in the underbrush and the bushes, you'll be like, I knew it, and that's a survival instinct built in to help us avoid dangers, because a key part of the brain, the brainstem, its main job is to keep you alive. And so recognizing threats is one of the ways it tries to do that. And so it's kind of built in, unfortunately. So your senses aren't 100% trustworthy, but hey, it's one more way to gather data and know things. Let's take a look at intuition now. Intuition has many definitions. Some of them really are cognitive functions where people say, oh, you jump to a quick assumption, a quick decision because your brain processed this information in the background. Hang on, I'm going to get rid of that sound. Intuition has several definitions, and some of them are talking about completely different processes. So when I talk about intuition, I'm not talking about the ones where they're really cognitive processes, where either your conscious mind just processes a lot of data and comes up with the answer really quick, or some information from your subconscious presents itself consciously and suddenly you have a impulse, a gut reaction. So what I'm talking about when I define intuition is observing and interpreting non-sensory and non-cognitive data. So something a little bit different. Let's take a look at a few examples and sources of this. Let's start with hunger and thirst. It may seem sensory because you're like, well, I feel hungry, I feel thirsty. But what's really going on, this is fascinating, discovered by Candace Pert in the 70s, is that there are neurotransmitters in your body that let's take thirst for example, when you get when you become dehydrated, your body somewhere it senses that and it sends out these neurotransmitters to make you feel thirsty. But these neurotransmitters do more than just that. They have different functions depending on where they land. So in the brain, while they make you feel thirsty, in the lungs, they say, hey, let's not let out so much moisture in our breath, so it conserves your moisture. So there's one thing that, again, it feels like touch. It feels like it's a feeling, not an emotion, but a feeling. And if you understand that feeling, then you've interpreted it and you know something. So I don't know if I'd really call that intuition actually, but it's an example to get us a little bit forward, to move us forward in this understanding. Pain is another perfect example. You think, well, I cut my finger, of course it's going to hurt. And logically it makes sense, but behind the scenes, it's much more involved than that. What you have is nociceptors. There are 3 different types. These are pain receptors. These are pain nerves. And depending on the kind of injury, different nociceptors send the message, but not straight to your brain. And the message is not pain even. First, it has to go through your dorsal horn at the base of your spine. And this is like a a circuit decider. It decides, am I going to send this message up to the brain or not? And if it gets past that point, it goes up to the brain, and then the brain decides, shall I interpret this as pain to teach somebody a lesson, or to get them to withdraw their hand from the fire, or to not get cut again, or so forth. And so really it's your brain that decides whether to make pain or not. And knowing this, understanding the brain, how it works, gives you so much more control over it, because what you can do is when you feel something painful, you can short circuit that last process and just consciously pay attention to the to the nerve signals actually coming up your body. So if you stub your toe, rather than, I mean, that hurts, right? And that's a fact, right? Well, you can change this. Pay attention to your toe, and you'll notice kind of a vibrating, what's the word? Anyway, a sensation coming up, and suddenly you're just experiencing these nerves kind of sending this humming sensation, and you've grabbed it before it got to your brain and turned it into pain. And actually, it doesn't have to be painful, even though it may not be comfortable. So, emotions is another one. Emotional maturity. There's a important word you've heard before, and that comes from understanding your emotions and having some kind of wisdom in how to deal with them. So when you get angry, rather than just lashing out at whoever seemed to cause your anger, understand that, hey, this is your emotion. Maybe lashing out is not the best idea, and maybe it's not their fault after all. So as you make your reactions conscious, and that's really what consciousness is all about. It's just becoming aware of everything going on, all these causes and your reactions to them, so you can live a better life. And the last one, ESP, extrasensory perception. If I had to summarize it down to 3 letters, what's more useful than that? And that means it refers to gathering information from other sources. Actually, chakras really doesn't belong. Let's do this one again. And finally, to lump a couple things into one more type of knowing is, we'll just call it ESP for short, extrasensory perception. So again, knowing things that are non-sensory and non-cognitive, and somehow the information hits your brain, and if you become aware of it and process it, then you can know things. And some of these things could be from inside your own self, similar to your emotions. Maybe you've heard of chakras. That is a really useful concept if you plan to enhance your intuition, because when you feel something in your throat or your stomach or your guts, you can look up, oh, which chakra is this? And it kind of gives you insight what that's about. Because frankly, even if all knowing happens in your brain is not all in your head. That's another thing discovered by Candace Pert. And if you want, you can read her book, The Molecules of Emotion. Excellent reading, very interesting. And it tells that there are brain cells around your heart. There's in your stomach, in fact, in your intestines, there's the equivalent of a cat's brain of neurons down there. And I'm sure that helps with our immune system, which is one of the key jobs of the intestines. And so anyway, being aware of yourself and your subconscious mind as well, which is quite cut off from your conscious mind. It speaks different languages, but if you can learn how to connect with that and understand those languages, then you can really understand yourself better and help it learn the things that you consciously want it to learn. How does this work? And of course, what ESP, maybe I should have used a better term there, but what it usually refers to when people talk about it is not within yourself, but without yourself, like the twins who moved to Los Angeles and New York, and the one in New York gets in a car accident. Of course, if you've ever driven there, you'd understand. And the one in Los Angeles just senses something's wrong and calls her up, says, what happened, right? I remember one of my first examples where I remember this happening. I was in college and I had a dentist appointment, and my mom came to pick me up at school. And I was up on the 4th floor of the business building, and no windows or anything. And all of a sudden I just had this sense like she's here. And so I went downstairs, and sure enough, she had just arrived. Now I know that's not proof, that's not evidence, but there are so many examples like this that when they stack up, you have to take it seriously and at least consider some of these things. And I have other experiences where I've got tons of that kind of evidence. I'll tell you about that later. How does this work? I don't know. If we can't measure it, we don't know exactly how it works. The most recent explanation I've heard, for which there's no evidence of why it works, but I like it, so I'm going to mention it to you just as a possibility, is called biophotons. And this means that inside your brain, as your brain works, it actually creates light in the visible spectrum. And so maybe that's entanglement theory, maybe that's connected to other sources of knowing, and that's how we sometimes know things and connections with people and such. So possibilities. Maybe in 5 years we'll figure out how to measure that, and we'll get proof of all this stuff. Not likely, but someday. What's coming up is the intuitive connection, and this is talking about that connection between people, like I just mentioned, and I'm going to show you how you could experience it. I've taught this to, I think, thousands of people. I think I can say that in the plural, with about 95% success rate, at least. So I'll show you how to do that, walk you through the steps, and then after that, we'll talk a little bit about Intuitive Bridge, which is an advanced use of the intuitive connection. All right, so before we go on now, there's your little overview of ways of knowing, of some of the ways we can break that down and analyze it. Now it's time for some discussion. So if you are watching this with someone else, please, after these questions, pause just for a few minutes and just discuss them and just apply it to yourself, so this knowledge, so you'll remember it. So it'll really give you some personal context for you. So first off, what do you know? And how certain are you that you know it? Can you list some things that you know that are facts, that are indisputable, like that you exist and you have a nose or whatever else? And how certain are you? And then which type of knowing is most valid? Is it more valid when experts tell you something because they've done research and proven things, or when you figured out and experienced it for yourself? And then which type of knowing do you rely on most? Think of some examples of that. How much is your perception influenced by experience? So your life experiences have certainly shaped your perception of the world. How much does that affect what you believe? And finally, how much are your beliefs influenced by emotions? Emotions are strong, they are powerful. We are wired for emotions to be more powerful in many cases for decision making than our conscious minds. So is that true of you? We like to think it's not. We like to think we're rational, but we're not as rational as we think we are. So hit pause, discuss these for a minute, then I'll just make a couple of comments and we'll move on. All right, let's jump to question 2 there, small question 2. Which type of knowing is most valid? I hope what you answered, or at least my answer for this, is it totally depends on what you're knowing. If I want to know something about astrophysics or advanced calculus, I don't know that stuff well enough to figure it out by myself. I'm not going to say, well, I think the star is this big. How would I even know, right? Somebody else has much better knowledge. But if I want to know my favorite flavor of ice cream this week, French vanilla, whatever it is, which changes, that's completely up to me, and nobody else can tell me that. So some things I like to experience for myself, you might tell me, oh, Istanbul is a fascinating city, or the Rocky Mountains are gorgeous in fall. Well, I would rather know that for myself from first-hand experience. You'd rather look at a menu or taste the food. How much is your perception influenced by experience? That's a good question to just remain aware of, especially if you find yourself really defending your opinions and really resisting anyone who thinks differently than you. That's a good sign that you might be a little oversensitive and not as open-minded as you think. So same with the last one. All right, moving on. Let's get into the intuitive connection. And I'm going to start with a question to warm you up to it. How do you feel about eye contact? If you happen to be watching this with somebody else, please take a moment, pause the video again, and look into each other's eyes, especially if you're strangers. Why does that make us feel vulnerable? Why is that frightening? It's because those are not just round circles with black dots in the center, are they? No, they really are the windows of the soul. We sense on an intuitive level that when someone looks in your eyes, they can see straight through you. And sometimes that's true. Maybe you've looked at people, and beyond their expressions, beyond their body language, you just know what they're feeling, or you know what they're like. This is much easier to discern, I think, well, sometimes it's easier with people you know, but then you think, oh, I just know you so well. But so with strangers, it's great. If you meet somebody and you think, this is a really loyal person, well, all right, body language and micro expressions really can influence your perception. So it's important to learn how to do this right. So make sure you're not reading those cues and reading the intuitive cues. So in case you don't know what body language and micro expressions are, if you're tense, if you fold your arms, these are all signals. If you have your hands kind of around your throat, like protectively, this means you're less comfortable and kind of closed off. Micro expressions, they film people having conversations with extremely high frame rates on the camera, and they notice somebody will make this little tiny expression that's so fast that there's no way the eye can really catch it, because your eyes work at about 60 hertz. That means about 60 frames per second, and the micro expressions I think are up in the 200 hertz kind of range. But what happens is somebody will make this little expression, and the other person talking with them will make it back, and it's totally a subconscious thing, but they've categorized, I think, a few dozen of these and their meanings, like this little shrug. Some of the researchers, the original researchers, were famous for this one. They said this is the Bill Clinton look that says, I know I messed up, but forgive me, okay? And it can be very effective. It can be very influential. But those kind of things don't make us feel vulnerable, not like the eye contact one. So there's just a little bit of evidence that it's not the same thing. Let's talk a little bit about cultural bias. We Westerners, if you're a Westerner, tend to be very rational, and we think if you can't measure it, then it doesn't exist. At least we can't know it exists, because we rely so heavily on that procedural knowing, don't we? And especially after the scientific revolution. Now, this opinion has swayed back and forth several times over the centuries. What's the most important knowing? Is it this rational, logical thought? Or is it more the emotional experience, romanticism, the experience of life and the richness of it? So we're kind of on the scientific side, and it's extremely valuable in so many ways. But it's not the only side, and other cultures are more aware of this intuitive connection. For example, I learned in a cross-cultural communication course in college, probably the most fascinating one I ever took, that in Japan, often when big businesses will meet to sign multi-billion dollar contracts, and what they'll do first is they'll just sit down and look at each other, because they want to get a sense of this other person and decide whether or not they can trust this person, whether or not this is the kind of person they want to work with. And when you learn to do this well, when you become aware of the part of your brain that receives and can understand this kind of knowledge, when you get enough practice that you start getting it right, because it is easy to make mistakes early. I'll talk more about that later. You come to trust that knowledge more than what someone says. They might come in with their fancy suit and a confident smile and a firm handshake, and you might think, oh, this is a swell person. But people can lie with their body language and stuff, but this intuitive connection, when you really get that, people can't really lie on that level. So that's one reason why it is so useful and interesting. So we're going to do two things with this. First, you're going to experience it. I'm going to walk you through the steps, and then you're going to do it. And then we'll take a minute to share with your partner, because I'm going to get everyone partnered up and share what you perceived. And I'll give you more details about that before also. And then, well, I'm going to give this in a class on Friday, so then we'll do a group discussion and talk a little bit about our experiences, which is always so much fun. Get the best stories out of it. I'll tell you a few stories in a second. By the way, This is all found in my book, True You. It has even more details and instructions. It has several pages of Q&A where all the questions anyone has ever asked me, and sometimes maybe even 5 or 6 answers to that question, along with some nice essays that talk about the value of being seen and how that is such a crucial human experience. It's so nurturing, so crucial, and yet so many people are not even aware of it, and we are really missing out. So you can pick that up on Amazon or uoflife.com/books. All right, let's move on to the experience. This is where you get to have your subjective experience of it, because this new kind of knowing, if this is new to you, how do you judge it if you don't have some personal experience? I doubt you trust me enough to just believe everything I say. So I want you to experience it for yourself, and then you can begin to form your own opinion about how awesome and amazing and valid it is. I won't tell you what to believe. I'll just tell you what I believe and try and get you to have your own experience so you can decide for yourself, which I think is much more effective. All right, eye contact makes the intuitive connection easier to detect. You don't actually have to make eye contact to do this, but it's really helpful at first when you're not familiar with that part of your brain that knows how to connect to other people and read all about them, sense all about them. So that's why we do that in the beginning. And what you're going to do is sit across from someone and you're going to stare in each other's eyes for 5 minutes. And if that makes you nervous, hey, remember, that's just more evidence that there is something real to this and you're about to find out. So what an adventure. Congratulations. When I do this in larger classes, usually the first minute, especially if my students are a little bit younger, like college age, for the first minute, they're laughy and giggly and uncomfortable because we are totally violating a cultural norm. We're invading people's privacy and people are feeling vulnerable and a little bit uncomfortable, and so they giggle. And so I'm going to ask you, oh, by the way, blinking is okay. This is not a staring contest, but I will ask for silence. I do ask for silence in the room so you don't distract other people. So like I said, for about the first minute, people are kind of laughing and people maybe breaking that rule and saying something because trying to get away from the tension, but everyone else is doing it, and so they're like, okay, I'll go with it. And by minute 2, there's this really kind of cool, intense feeling that kind of pervades the room, and just all this connection going on. It's the coolest thing. And by minute 4 or 5, when I end it, they can't believe the time's up, and some of them, of course, it's not working. They're nervous, they're self-conscious, and they just don't relax enough. It just doesn't happen. And frankly, some people are harder to read on some days than maybe somebody else. So if it doesn't work for you at first, sure, try somebody else, see how it works. And if you can try this with a stranger, much easier, because you won't look at someone and say, oh, you're a loyal friend. You're really close to your mother, and you won't think, well, I already knew that, so this is dumb, that didn't work. If you look at a stranger and say you have a really close relationship with your mother, which is the kind of thing which is pretty common to see in this first experience, then you'll know, I had no way of knowing that. It's not like a horoscope that says today is a good day to buy a pet. This does not apply to everyone. We don't all have great relationships with our parents. So if you see something like that, you can think, hey, maybe there's something to it. The most common kind of things you'll sense are character traits. You're loyal, you're smart. Oh, by the way, if you notice someone, you're really intelligent, pay closer attention, because you'll discover there are all kinds of different intelligences, and it's really interesting to see the different ones. Some people, maybe they have connection intelligence, where they understand other people really well, or process intelligence, where they see how processes flow and where the bottlenecks are and how to fix them, and so many other ones. So anyway, 5 minutes of that, and the real thing you need to know of how to do it is try to clear your thoughts and just wait for an impression or a feeling or a sensation to strike you. In clearing your thoughts, don't overthink it. Just, if some thought comes in your mind, just kind of let it float away and just try and relax. Just get this sense of relaxation and look in their eyes. And then eventually this impression is going to strike you. And it's not something that you're likely to understand at first. Maybe, if you're familiar with it, maybe you will. But it helps. Well, it's kind of an emotional, what we'd call a right brain experience. Actually, right and left brain are almost identical, except for left brain has language. So, but I still think it's still valid to say right brain because it's not the non-language part, which is often emotional and imagery. That's the languages of the subconscious mind. So hold on to that sensation until your left brain gets a handle on it and puts some words to it and says, oh, I recognize it. It's this word. It's pride. It's joyfulness. It's playfulness. It's intensity, whatever trait or thing you're noticing. And sometimes to hold on to that sensation and give your brain time to understand it, it may help to visualize that impression. And again, the brain works in images, metaphors, so the subconscious. So any image is fine. If you have this feeling that feels big and heavy and dense, you might see it as a rock. You might assign a color to it. Think about the size and weight and just feel that feeling until your brain latches on and says, oh, you're very competitive, until the left brain gets it. So that's how it works. Here are a few more examples of common things people sense as they try this. As I mentioned, a lot of times it's character traits. Sometimes it's more specific, like you're close to your mother or things like that. Sometimes it's extremely detailed. Once I remember a couple students, and this was fairly early in a semester, I was teaching writing, I was teaching audience awareness, and so I figured, hey, this works in a little bit, and it had come up, and so I taught the class this. And two students who had never even talked before, one of them, as they had time in Paris to just share what they had sensed in each other, one said, I don't know, I just visualized a bonfire on a beach and a bunch of people, and he's not really believing that he had detected anything. Well, to his surprise, this other student, it was his first semester away from Hawaii in school, and he was really missing his friends who he used to go to bonfires on the beach with. So there's an example. I remember once when I was first learning this over 30 years ago, I thought it was so cool. So my friends would make me do it like a party trick, meeting girls and stuff. And once I was practicing on my friend Chuck, and I said, I got this kind of picture of you driving down I-15 and these two girls. And what that apparently related to was he was about to go to school down south, 100 miles away, and there are these two girls he was interested in dating. So sometimes you get specific things like that. Once I remember meeting girls, tried it out, and I told this girl, I said, when you were like in 7th or 8th grade, something happened that made you make a decision to stand for justice and defend the underdog. And she told me a story of exactly that, of how someone was getting picked on at her locker, and somebody, I think they went and slammed the locker door shut or whatever, and she just boiled her blood, and she walked up and said, hey, don't treat them like that, and just made that commitment to stand up for people. So, okay, so I've talked much too long already. Set a timer for about 5 minutes, make eye contact, clear your mind, wait for an impression, hold on, visualize that impression until you understand it. You can make a few notes if you want. I have lots of other funny stories. I'll just tell you one more. If you stare at something for too long at the same exact thing, then you get nerve fatigue. The cones and rods in your eyes stop sending their signal because they've just been sending the same signal over and over. And so maybe whoever's face you're looking at will seem to kind of disappear. So if that happens, just look away for a second and look back. Once a student asked me, I think I saw his spirit, but I'm pretty sure it was nerve fatigue and not that. But okay, do that, pause the video, come back, and we'll go from there. Welcome back. I hope you had a great experience. I hope it was fascinating. And to find out if it was, take several minutes, however long you want, and explain to your partner what you experienced. Don't doubt yourself. This is just an experiment. You don't have to have everything right. Sometimes you'll sense something and you won't have quite the perfect words to get it exactly right, but you might be ballpark. It takes experience before you really get this down well. Or who knows, maybe you got some really clear experience, sensations, impressions, and you're just confident that you know something's true. And I'll tell you, when this gets clear, I trust this knowing more than received or subjective or other knowing. I had one friend in particular who we talked about this. I, read her and told her some things about her, and she was just disappointed. She's like, that you don't see me at all. She was really actually kind of hurt. She said, why can you see everyone else and you can't see me? And was just adamant that I was completely wrong. Well, we remained friends, and months later, as she got to know herself better and such, she realized that I had actually, in fact, been correct, that she had created this persona which she wanted people to see her as, but it wasn't really the truth about her. And so what I had seen actually was true. So sometimes it's clear and you can learn to trust it, but it takes experience. So share. Pause the video, come back. All right, here's where we discuss as a class. If you are taking this, if you're watching this with several people, go ahead and share that. What do you experience? How reliable is this data that you are sensing? How much do you trust it so far? This is new, so maybe not that much, but discuss that. What applications can you imagine for the intuitive connection? One of my favorite one is relationships. You can get to know people so much better, so much more deeply, and boy, does that help you appreciate them. Because when you see people at their core level, one question I had in college, one of my minors was political science, and one of the key questions in poli-sci is, are people inherently good or inherently evil? And I wondered, I didn't know. But once I looked at enough people and saw them down at their core where it really begins, beyond all the crap and garbage and ego and stuff piled up on that, I realized 100% I'm convinced that people are inherently good. But I'm also convinced that on top of that, there's plenty of immaturity and thoughts and problems and issues that can make you jerk. So people are not inherently mature. All right, so that's the main part of this. I promised to go a little bit into Intuitive Bridge. This is an advanced application of it. And what happens is I got wondering after reading people, I call it reading, it just means sensing. Sometimes I'll use the word see, like I see this in you. I don't actually see it. I just sense it and attach a meaning to it. But because a lot of us are visual thinkers and we're so familiar with seeing as receiving data, receiving knowledge, I just use the word see. But I wondered if I can see data in people and read it out of them, is there a two-way street where I can push information in and interact? Is each person an island completely cut off from others, or is there a bridge between us that lets us connect on this very deep, satisfying, fascinating, useful level? And what I discovered is absolutely yes, there's a bridge. It goes both ways. So I did some experimentation. First time after I thought of this question, I tried it at a party and I couldn't really tell a difference. But the second time I tried it, I happened to be at church the next day, and I sat down, and down the row is a friend of mine. She's smart. She likes me, a friend. But there had always been something between us, some little irritation, like a piece of sand in an oyster. Just something always irritated me. And I thought, if I feel irritated, that's my problem. I will see what I can do about it. So I knew these other healing skills as well. And I found the connection to her, and like I said, you don't have to make eye contact. So I didn't stare at her. That would have been creepy, right? But I found the connection where I could feel her self, whatever that is, and I found the little irritation. And at first, I imagined it as a little black marble, little black and gray swirly kind of marble, kind of hard and dense. And I thought, okay, and I recognized that because I'd done this on myself. If this is an issue, that's what it feel like. So great. And I used some of my techniques. I'll tell you about some of those in a second. And this marble began to soften up, and it began to expand and soften and get lighter and lighter and bigger and softer until it was dispersed entirely, and I couldn't feel it anymore. I couldn't find that feeling. And I thought, well, that's how it's supposed to feel if it works. So maybe I will notice a difference. Maybe I won't have that little irritation. And by the way, as working on this, my brain attached a word to it, vanity. And I thought, okay, great. That's the thing that irritated me, a little bit of vanity, just a drop of it. Fine, great. Well, the meeting ended and she scoots down the row and she doesn't even say hello. She says, I think I've always let my pride get in my way. And that's not very smart, is it? And I thought, holy cow, this totally works. That's exactly what, through this connection and through me doing the techniques, adding some light, whatever to it, her knowledge expanded and she learned this thing and she was aware of it. She was a smart girl. So, and so what I realized about whether it's a two-way communication or not, that if there's a signal that I'm reading, then obviously it's getting transmitted from somewhere. And so if she's transmitting, why can't I transmit and have her read it, even if she wasn't aware of it? Now, I will stop and make a subnote, a PS right here, that a lot of energy healers, they have a maxim that says you never work on anybody without their permission. So I'll acknowledge that at this point and I'll address it in a few points later. When you do this, when you connect to people and use it for healing purposes, and in particular, it's useful to learn subconscious languages. So brain science is so useful to know because it guides you and helps you make sense of why these things work and how they work best. And so, but what we can't just use our subconscious because we can't consciously control our subconscious, right? So instead, we need a lingua franca, a language that's understood both by the subconscious brain, where our real problems are, our real blocks and limitations and beliefs and stuckness are, and that it's also understood by our conscious mind so that they can talk together, because our conscious mind is what we have some control over. And so the two languages that are spoken by both the subconscious and the conscious are imagery or metaphor. So when you detect a feeling and you come up with some image for it, maybe it's fear, and you think of a spider or a big cliff or a shark. It doesn't matter what you choose because it's just metaphor. You need something that represents that emotion. This happens in dreams all the time. If you dream some wolf coming to attack you, it's just some uncomfortable feeling in there, and your brain came up with an image to match it. Maybe tomorrow it'll be a shark or a comet coming to smash the world, whatever. And the other language is emotion. They're in the hypothalamus, the seat of emotion. Boy, if there's one thing that runs your life, that's it, because emotions are so extremely powerful. Understanding subconscious priorities and processes also helps. So you can just, again, understanding the science behind how this works. And as I mentioned before, a major part of your subconscious mind, the brainstem, it's concerned with the survival, technically not your survival, but survival of the human race. And so it watches for threats. And when it sees threats, it often shuts down, closes off, and tries to protect itself. So when you find these little stuck emotions and fears, usually they're trying to protect the person. When you understand that, you can come at it with a little bit more compassion, and which is useful. The next point, you will see why. So recognize block energies. Often they feel dark and dense, like that little black and gray marble that I mentioned earlier. And one useful way to find these is just imagine you've got this net, like a fisherman's net, and just pass it through the person, and it just passes right on through, but where there's a stuck spot, it kind of gets caught. So that's one great way to find and identify these stuck spots. And then when you do, make the mind feel safe. It's trying to protect, right? So if it feels threatened, it's going to put up its dukes and not let you in and not let anything change. But if you do make it feel safe, then it's more likely, this can be tough, it takes some experience sometimes, to get it to lower its defenses and let you interact with it, and then it learns and heals. So one key way to make it feel safe is don't judge it. Don't say, hey, you got to change. Just look at it and say, oh, you're trying to protect. It's okay. You're just a feeling, no judgment. And that helps not create more conflict and defense. And then the other thing is, especially once you go in there relaxed, don't just look at the negative, but bring in some happy, positive, hopeful thoughts with you. those thoughts feel good, and the brain will react to those and respond. It will try and embrace those. And then when you think these, the stress and the fear and the protection and shutdown and depression together, but you bring in this happy, hopeful, strong determination, confidence, when you're thinking those two things, those neurons kind of fire together, and eventually the positive ones will teach the negative ones, and your brain will latch onto the good feeling one. I've taught this to several people, and they've picked up on it quite well, but everyone has different abilities, different talent for this, for how quickly they can learn it. So it may take some time. And then show it a new perspective. As you bring the light in, the happiness, that's what I was just talking about. And as you do this, for my guidance, it's really important to do what feels right. It feels good. It just feels comfortable. That's the right thing. So rather than always getting people's permission, there is actually, I often do, but if something feels like the absolute right thing to do, then I feel like I'm getting their permission on a subconscious level. And that's really the part that is most important there. Also, if you're going in with ego and you're trying to change people and say, I think you should be more confident, let's insert some confidence. That's, trust your intuition and let it do the work. Let it, bring the light in. Your logic is limited. It has limited value in this case, because maybe confidence and stuff is not really the lesson that that spot in their brain needs right now. I remember when I was a kid, got picked on a little bit in elementary school. Not too bad. Nothing like the bullying you hear about today, which is atrocious. So problematic, causes people lifelong problems. So do stand up against bullying. But as my youngest brother, we were kind of raising him and teaching him to play soccer, and we're like, we're going to make you tough. Well, he was a sensitive soul. That's not really the defense that he needed. So there's just one little example. Go with your intuition. Logic is limited, and bring the light in and let it kind of evolve by itself. Now, I know this is a really quick, really short, not very detailed overview, and so I did write a book about this a couple years ago, 300 pages, that walks you through step by step the science, how your brain works, short chapters, techniques that start out with just very simple sensing things and then get to some more complex, just a compendium of as many of my techniques I had come up with over the many years, the decades that I've been practicing this. Because like I said, sometimes you find some protection. It doesn't want to let you in. It doesn't want to change. And so when something didn't work, I'd say, well, let me find a way that does work. And I would go around to the other side, imagery-wise, and suddenly it would work, and so forth. So tons of good ideas. If you want to learn about it, Heal Your Emotions, there's the book on Amazon, on youoflife.com. Very useful. And that concludes our lecture on ways of knowing. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you found it useful. I hope you learn and apply these skills. I would love nothing more than if our world just learned to look in each other's eyes. The hatred, the fear, the animosity, the competition would diminish so dramatically as we saw people for who they really are and saw that people are inherently good. And you yourself, I swear, you're 10 or 100 or maybe 1,000 times better than you think. And as you practice seeing the good in other people, you'll have an easier time seeing it in yourself as well. So carry on. Go to youoflife.com, find this lecture, and I would love to hear your experiences in the comments. And we'll talk to you next time. Until then, live smart, live happy.